Hello, everyone. My name is Joey Barnett, and you're listening to Chatting with Charlie, EB-5 Investor Outlook, September 2024. It is wonderful to be here today. We've got a great episode on because it is a new fiscal year. Fiscal year 2025 starts on October 1st, so we got a lot to talk about. It's very exciting. As always, I am joined by Mr. Charlie Oppenheim, who's the Director of Visa Consulting. Just got back from the West Coast. Good to see you, Charlie.
It's a pleasure to be here.
And it is a very fun time right now in EB-5. We have a lot of cases being filed, a lot of new data coming out. We got some FOIA data that we're going to be talking about today, and we're very excited to get into it. Of course, this doesn't constitute legal advice. It's just for information purposes, but we'd be happy to schedule a consultation with you. You can reach out to our firm at the following email addresses. We'll also give you some QR codes at the end of the presentation and some email addresses if you have any questions. If you're listening, you know that I hope you know that WR is a well-respected immigration firm. We have offices around the United States and globally, and we are consistently thought of as a top EB-5 firm. We have filed hundreds, if not thousands, of EB-5 cases for immigrant investors and have helped thousands of folks get their green card through this EB-5 program. And EB-5 is very active right now, as I mentioned, because of the new EB-5 Reform and Integrity Act of 2022, which reinvigorated the industry, created these new visa categories, opened up visa lines, and are giving people opportunities to get green cards much faster than they were before. And now that we've been in it for the past couple of years, we have some good data relating to the demand for these visas, and we're going to be sharing that with you today. And then we're also going to be talking about the supply of visas, what we want to see, what isn't happening, and what is happening at the Department of State and at USCIS. So that's kind of what the roadmap is, and let's just jump into it. So Charlie, the first slide that we have here shows the October 2024 Visa Bulletin, shows the movement in the Chart A dates for the unreserved. So this is for pre-RIA EB-5 investors. There's two groups, Chinese mainland born and India, that have had backlogs. And because it's a new fiscal year, can you tell us what happened and why it happened?
Sure. Effective October 1st, as you said, the State Department has the full supply of numbers which will be available for use throughout fiscal 2025. And I think this has resulted in them making a major advancement of both the China and India unreserved dates. I would expect both the July 15th of 2016 China date and the January 1st of 2022 India date. I would expect these to be held for at least the next 6 months, potentially most of the fiscal year. The reason is I believe that they have opened up the doors to try to generate sufficient demand, but these dates by no means indicate that all the applicants within these dates will be scheduled for interview in October or November or December. I believe they'll be spread out over, like I said, at least the first 6 months or possibly longer without any forward movement of the dates.
So were you surprised when you saw these advancements?
I was a little bit surprised that they made such a big jump all at once, but it appeared that last year, it seemed that the State Department was making large movements of the final action dates at the beginning of each of the first 3 quarters, in October, December, and then April, and then potentially would hold on to those dates for the remainder of the quarter to see what the demand was. But they may have also made these big, giant advancements because there are other processing concerns that they have in the future, potentially at Guangzhou or the India Post, or for other reasons. So again, I would not read too much into these large. In the instance of China, it was a 7-month movement. I would not read that people to expect that they're going to be future large advancements. Again, expect these dates to hold at least for the first 6 months, if not most of the fiscal year.
But This also doesn't mean that somebody who filed, say, on July 14th, 2016, a China mainland investor, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to get an immigrant visa issued this fiscal year, does it?
It should. Actually, this should represent that there's enough numbers that the State Department estimates would be available for any Chinese applicant who has a priority date earlier than July 15th of 2016. So again, they may not be scheduled until later in the year, but there should, based on this, having moved it so much to begin with, there should be numbers available. I personally would have maybe made smaller incremental movements throughout the year to gauge how much demand there was and how many numbers were being used. It would have been potentially better to make those smaller incremental moves to avoid future retrogressions. This giant move for both the large move for both categories, the India and China, increases the odds of a potential retrogression at some point toward the end of the year.
I want to stick with China for one moment before we get into India. And the reason why I asked my question, and maybe the reason why you're saying you would have done smaller forward movements, I think is really based on this chart, right? And the numbers that we see here. And this shows the number of EB-5 visa applicants registered at NVC based on their priority date. Now, this was as of May of 2024. So there's been a fair number of visa numbers issued to potentially folks in 2014 and 2015. But there's a lot of filings that happened in 2015 and 2016. The question becomes, is there going to be enough visas available to get through all of 2015 and into the 2016 group, right?
Yeah, one thing I have concerns with this data is, for example, China, the 2014 applicants. Those applicants have been eligible for processing for at least a year or more. And most of the 2015 applicants have been eligible throughout fiscal 2024 until the limit was reached. So it makes me kind of wonder if these are actual still demand, or are these cases that are on the books but are unlikely to result in the use of a visa number in the future? Again, because they've been eligible for so long, why wouldn't they have been processed earlier? But you never can count out things. But again, with my reasoning why I would have advanced the dates at a slower pace, the 2016 cases have not been eligible in the past years. Therefore, there is plenty of demand. So they could have moved the final action date ahead incrementally, knowing that they had plenty of demand to allow number use to be maximized by the end of the year. So they could have made it slower for the first half of the year, maybe. And if they saw they weren't using as many numbers as they expected, for the second half, they could have made larger advancements of the date. But again, this such a 7-month advance right away, which covers more than half of the demand in 2016 for China, that increases the potential for retrogression at a later point or numbers running out for China.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Can I get back to something that you were saying before about the folks who've had a visa available and haven't moved forward on their case?
Right.
That still is considered demand, though, to the Department of State when they are setting these dates, right?
It is, but
Or is there a, I don't know, like a discount? Or, I mean, like is there some sort of percentage which they assume, or is it all, part of that full demand?
well, these applicants say with 2014 dates, they would have been notified by the National Visa Center years ago to start assembling and submitting certain required documentation. The same with any of the applicants with priority dates through December 15th of 2022. So if they had submitted their documentation, they would be in the quote pool that the State Department is looking at for future use. And they would potentially, use a number. So it's possible that somebody with a January or, a 2014 date that has just been dragging their feet for whatever reason, suddenly they submit the final documentation, well, they'd be pushed to the front of the line. But again, I'm not really, confident that that is true demand, especially with China, where if I were a Chinese applicant with a 2014 date, I would have moved in a much more timely manner, allowing my visa to be issued long ago. The same with 2015 dates.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. But I guess the point, or the thing I'm trying to make, is that when the Department of State is thinking about the demand, they're still including these people that have had the opportunity to do it years for years.
They're only incidentally using that information. The State Department is concerned with the people that are documentarily complete, have all their documents, or it is reasonable to believe they will submit the final documentation in a relatively short period. So they may feel it's reasonable to expect, say, Chinese applicants with an October 2015 date or beyond that to submit the final documentation in the coming months. They may consider that, but I would not be considering the 2014 data too seriously. I would also be inquiring with the National Visa Center if they're seeing any type of response rate from that old demand, the applicants. Again, the people can keep their cases, quote, alive. All they have to do is periodically submit a piece of information, and that will keep the case active and on the books. If somebody does not act within 1 year of being notified to assemble and submit documents, at the end of that first year, they're told if they do not submit the required information within the next year, their case would be terminated. But if there's, say, 6 pieces of information, they could submit 1 piece of information, and that starts the 2-year clock starting all over again. It's kind of a confusing thing, but again, people can kind of try to keep their cases alive into the future.
Yeah, we have a number of clients who do that for a variety of reasons, whether it's finishing school or finishing up a job or something like that. It's
Yeah.
not uncommon. Do you have anything you want to say about the unreserved India forward movement date? It just sort of means that anybody who's in the United States from India who filed before the RIA was enacted can do an adjustment of status. And that's a great advancement. If there are people out there who are looking to file that adjustment of status, we'd be happy to help. You can get your EAD, you can get your advanced parole, and maybe have a little bit more freedom rather than just being sponsored by your H-1B. Obviously, every person's case is different.
That's an excellent point. And on the following chart, where you'll notice that the India demand is not as high as what the China demands. So the India date has a much greater potential for that date to be advanced in the future, because we're just kind of running out of pending demand with more recent priority dates for India. So that's a huge benefit for the Indian applicants. And again, these dates and the application filing dates are an indication anybody that is within the U.S. has the opportunity to file their adjustment of status, and they should do so in a very timely manner while they can use the application filing dates.
Right, and that's exactly what we're going to be talking about next. Here are the final action dates. So chart A, this shows the advancement that we were talking about a couple of slides ago. The only thing I wanted to mention here is that it remains current for the set-aside reserve visa categories, as they have been since their existence, over 2 years ago. And I guess my first question here is, did we use any of those visa numbers last year? How long is this going to remain current? These are the types of things that we're going to be talking about now and next month as well as we get further into it. But really the big benefit is for those who are in the United States. USCIS is going to allow adjustment of status next month and for, I imagine, the next couple of months based on Chart B. That is also current. I'm expecting a high level of demand from people in the United States who want to continue their immigration journey through EB-5 because their EB-2 priority date is not getting any closer, or they want some protection from potential layoffs that are happening. So that's why we're seeing a big demand for EB-5. Charlie, anything else you wanted to talk about with the set-asides? I don't really want to talk about movement because we're going to get there later, but anything else from just...
as you say, they've remained current since the inception of the program. approximately 100 numbers may have been used during fiscal 2024. It should be expected that number use should start to increase throughout fiscal 2025.
Well, it better.
Yes.
Can't get any worse.
If it does not, then serious questions have to be asked. Why are numbers not being used? Why are cases not being approved at a higher rate, allowing the potential scheduling of cases at either USCIS or Department of State?
And that's actually a great transition to this slide up here, which you may have seen before, but now we have an added line on top for fiscal year 2025. And I'm looking at the light blue 4,478 number. Those were originally for reserved, and then they were carried over for 1 year into reserved, and now they're being carried over into the unreserved. And that difference from 2024 to 2025 is that 100 that Charlie just mentioned. And that's based on, again, it's assumption. We don't believe the Department of State has issued any reserved visas in fiscal year 2024. And we know that there's a handful of adjustment of status approvals. We don't have the data at this time to say how many. So we're just using as an assumption 100. Another assumption that we're having here is the worldwide level for employment-based in fiscal year 2025. Charlie, why don't we have that number yet from the Department of State? When do you think we will get it? And why did you estimate 150K here?
I estimated the 150,000 because I believe the State Department should have been able to be back to, quote, normal processing capacity and have been addressing the COVID-related backlog which developed. Therefore, they should have maximized number use. The State Department did not move either the August or September final action dates for most family categories, which should have indicated that they believed that they were going to be very close to the annual limit. Therefore, I believe that 150,000, for the sake of argument, would be reasonable to expect. That may be a maximum. I would not be surprised if it was as low as 145,000, but the difference is not going to be statistically significant for this chart purposes.
Okay. And why do you think we don't have that number yet? Isn't that something that's normally put out in the October Visa Bulletin?
No. Actually, for the family-sponsored, they know the annual limit. The family-sponsored limit will be 226,000 unless there's, at some point, a legislative change. Right now, they need to know how many of the 2024 numbers were actually used for family before they can establish the employment category, because any unused family numbers from 2024 get added to the 2025 limit. There's also certain required information that needs to be received from USCIS regarding immediate relative and other adjustment of status data. That data may not be available to the State Department for a considerable amount of time, but I would not be surprised if in the November or December bulletin that they did mention what they believe the employment limit will be for 2025. They can make a pretty good guess and probably be within 1,000 or so based on the data they have when they publish the December visa bulletin.
Okay, well, it's something to keep our eye out on. And the reason why I asked that question is these are just assumed numbers, right? These aren't the actual numbers that will be there in fiscal year 2025. It's just based on some assumptions that we have. And really the big thing that I want to show here is that there's going to be, in total, based on these assumptions, over 18,000 EB-5 visa numbers in fiscal year 2025. And the majority of those, 11,620, are going to the unreserved category. My thought is they're probably going to use all of those 11,620, just like they have used all of the other unreserved numbers for the past 2 fiscal years. At least that's my hope, and I'm sure that's what their goal is. So I'm not too concerned about the unreserved use because they seem to be doing a good job. Our concern, or my greater concern, is, well, when are they going to start issuing these reserve visa numbers, these people who have invested minimum of $800,000, within the past 2 years and expecting these visas to be issued? I just wanted to sort of pull that together. And when we look at the visa allocation for the reserved categories, we break it down by dividing this number that we have, 7,066. That's the reserved total number. Rural gets 62.5% of those. High unemployment gets 31.25% of those. And infrastructure gets 6.25% of those. So here are the numbers for fiscal year 2025 based on these, assumptions that we talked about in the last slide for how many visas are in each reserved category. And you can see the rural is significantly higher, right? Because they have twice as many visa numbers. And I just want you guys to keep this in mind because next we're going to be talking about demand. And the final action date can only be imposed by the Department of State when the demand exceeds the supply. And so the question becomes well, how many visa numbers is there right now in the existing pipeline? And is it going to exceed these numbers that we see on the far right column? Charlie, am I getting that right?
Yes, perfect.
All right. Sounds good. And we did in this chart here, the carryovers from 2024, assuming that only 100 were used, plus the 2025 limits that we have. All right, so now we're going to be talking about the FOIA data that we were able to obtain from USCIS last week. We've shared it with people, and you can download it here by using this QR code. It's at the bottom of the blog. You have to click and download, and it's very exciting to sort of contribute to the knowledge that is there. I wish USCIS would just publicly provide this information on their own, but they don't. So we are having to do these FOIAs. I was very surprised how quickly I got this FOIA. Usually people have to litigate to get this type of data. So thank you, USCIS FOIA team, for sending it over to me. And we're going to be now kind of talking through what that data is. And the first thing that I want to say is we were given this information and it has a date. It says as of April 18th, 2024. The reason why this data is important is because if you were to look at that date, you would think, okay, that encompasses all of the I-526E filings that occurred before the April 1st USCIS filing fee increase. And there was a huge number of EB-5 cases that were filed during that quarter. There was over 1,800 cases filed in Q2 of 2024. That's a lot of visa demand. But the point I guess I want to make is that this doesn't necessarily match the official data that they're posting on their website that everybody can see. So what we are thinking is that this report was ran on April 18th, but it may not and likely does not include all of the I-526E filings as of that date. So we think it actually may go before April 1st based on the data that they have imposed. Either way, it's an update from the last data that we had, which I believe was from November of 2023. So it provides a 5-month or so update on EB-5 demand and a large part of that filing spree that we had in March of this year. And you can see still that there is significantly more filings in the high unemployment area visa category than the rural visa category. And Charlie, I guess my first question to you is, what did you think about the total numbers? I mean, did this data surprise you at all? Were you expecting to see something different?
I was expecting a little bit more because, as you mentioned before, a filing fee increase or a category expiring, there's a huge spike in filings. The one thing that this spike in filings during the first quarter of fiscal 24 will indicate that whenever final action dates are imposed, there will be a large number of applicants with priority dates in the, say, January through April timeframe. Therefore, as I said, once final action dates are imposed, it will probably take some time to move through that demand, and forward movement of the final action dates is likely to be slow when that happens in the future.
That's a good point. The next slide that we have shows the top countries for each of the fiscal years for 2024. It's through, again, April 18th. And you can see there isn't much change. That's really all I wanted to show here. all you can see is there's increasing significantly, I think. And we'll see more for 2024 for China and India. But it's interesting how certain countries like Taiwan and South Korea have typically stayed away from the rural EB-5 investments. I think there's a pretty good reason why. From a visa point of view, Charlie, why are they going with high unemployment as opposed to rural?
I think that all these totals kind of reflect the pre-RIA type of filings. These are the top countries, and they will kind of put their investments in the area they think they'll be reached most quickly. I believe the high unemployment areas, there were more available early on, and I think that's why you had a higher amount of filings early on in the category. And then we've kind of caught up with the rural filings.
Isn't it also that for Taiwan and South Korea, they don't really have to worry about any kind of visa backlog?
Right.
So they're not going into the rural area where they have more visa numbers, right? I think it's less of a concern for them than it may be for China or for India, which is a big reason why they go into that type of investment.
Yeah, none of these totals for those countries even approach what their per country limit is likely to be in the future. So again, as you said, they're kind of looking back historically in the pre-RIA. There were not final action dates, or for Vietnam, when they were imposed, it was for a very limited amount of time. So, they feel very safe, and their feelings are well founded. They are not likely to have any concern in the foreseeable future.
Let's expand it out a little bit more. These are the top 10 countries that we see for fiscal year 2023 and 2024 through April 18th. The big thing that I see here is we mentioned how rural is completely dominated by China and India. But just in general, the numbers, you just see how much the demand from China is. It's significant. And because these final action dates for these categories are current, I don't really see any reason why there would be a slowdown unless people understand this invisible backlog that is growing based on the pending I-526Es. What are your thoughts on that, Charlie?
No, I think you're accurate on that observation.
Yeah, so I expect China to continue to be the big player as it always has been in EB-5. But, here we see some of these other countries. There's only 11 from UK, less than 10 from South Africa. It's just very interesting to look at, and something that I'm sure regional centers will be looking at as well as they figure out their marketing and promotional efforts.
In terms of this, as you mentioned, these countries where they've got such small totals, except for India and China, no other country in the world even is remotely close to their per country limit. So meaning they'll be current unless and until a worldwide date were ever imposed. Otherwise, it's only going to be the Chinese and Indians. And the fact that there is such low demand from, quote, rest of world countries is a good sign for China, because any otherwise unused numbers under the various annual limits, numbers are then being made available strictly in priority date order. Therefore, those numbers would be distributed to China and India based on their priority dates. So for China and India, that's a positive sign that there is less rest of world demand.
Yes, I think that's a very important point, and something I kind of just want to clarify. Historically, and Charlie, you may know the actual number, but China has used well over 50% of the EB-5 visa numbers. I think in some years, maybe up to 80% or so. I honestly, I don't know, but it's a large majority, well over their per country cap. And the reason why is because these otherwise unused rest of world numbers can be made available to them because they have the earliest priority dates. And what we see from this data here is that there is significantly less rest of world rural demand than there is high unemployment demand, meaning there will be more visa numbers available to Chinese and Indian rural investors, those otherwise unused. In the high unemployment area, again, this depends on USCIS processing of I-526s, how quickly consulates are issuing visas, how quickly DOS is approving adjustment of status cases. But I just think in general, there's going to be less otherwise unused numbers available for China and for India, which means that once a final action date is imposed, it will likely move forward slower than for rural. Am I getting that right, Charlie?
Yes, you are.
Okay. And what are your thoughts about like an establishment of a final action date? And you know, I want you to kind of tease it because we're not going to get into it deep. Next month, we want you guys all to come back. We're going to have much more detailed slides. We just got this data on Friday, so we'll have more time to really dig into it. But just in general, I mean, when you see this demand data, does that make you, and then when you look at the supply data, does it make you feel like fiscal year 2025, it's going to remain current for both China and for India in both visa categories?
I think for rural and infrastructure categories, I believe the categories will be current throughout fiscal 2025. I think that on the high unemployment area, I think it is likely that a final action date could be applied in the summer months at some point. But that is completely dependent upon how quickly processing can be ramped up at both overseas posts and USCIS. Right now, we have not seen anything to indicate that number use will be at excessive limits. And again, demand and number use would have to be markedly increased throughout fiscal 2025. And we will be able to see that to some extent. The State Department publishes data on the monthly number use by visa category and country. So by the time we get to January or February, we may have an indication of what the number use looks like. So, but we'll have to wait and see. But again, I believe rural and infrastructure will stay current throughout fiscal 2025. And I would have the high unemployment area on the lookout for a potential date in the summer, but that would be a worst case scenario. And by summer, that could maybe only August or September.
Thank you. And can I ask, there's 3 times as many China high unemployment than India in the high unemployment area. If a final action date is imposed at the end of the summer 2025, would that be for China? Would that be for India? Would it be for both? Would it also be for rest of world? I'm just trying to get some ideas of what that would be.
I think it would definitely be for China, most likely India, and possibly for rest of world. Rest of world, the numbers have to be made available for potential use up to the per country limits in rest of world. So China and India definitely have enough demand to potentially reach their annual limit. Therefore, that's when a final action date would be applied if number use is actually approaching it. Rest of world, like I said, you have to keep in reserve rest of world numbers. I think that rest of world would probably stay current throughout fiscal 2025.
Okay. I mean, when I'm just looking at that 946 number, I think, okay, that's possibly over 2,500 visa numbers right there, right?
Yeah.
And when you look at the supply of high unemployment numbers, especially as that annual limit decreases, went from 161 to, we're assuming 150,000 or maybe less, there's going to be a lower amount of supply of those visa numbers.
If we were to assume there's 2.5 applicants per case, that would, for high unemployment, that would result in almost 7,000 applicants, and the high unemployment limit's only going to be approximately 2,200 numbers. So that is why I'm saying high unemployment area is where we're going to first see some type of final action date applied, whether it's strictly for India, China, or on a worldwide base, or a combination of the three. And it's likely to be a combination of three: a date for India, a date for China, and a date for rest of world applicants.
Thank you. Well, you heard it here first, folks. So when it happens, You could say Charlie's the what do people call you? The Notre Dame of the Bulletin?
I'm glad you mentioned that. This indicates people should act on when they're requesting, State Department or immigration requests information. You need to submit it as quickly as possible. You want to act in a timely manner while the category is still current, because again, the categories are current now. They may be current for the next 5 or 6 months, but it's the final action date, which applies in the month your case can be finalized, which governs whether your case can be finalized, not the fact that it was current now. The other thing is, I would strongly advise any applicant to avoid rescheduling a scheduled appointment. If you reschedule appointments, you run the risk of visas not being available in that subsequent month. So, and we used to see this a lot, primarily in the China EB-5 under the old category, where applicants would be eligible for interview starting in October through the early part of the year, but they would reschedule or delay their appointment to the summer months when it was more convenient for travel, for kids being out of school. But doing so runs the risk of numbers running out. And we saw that with the employment categories. Numbers ran out in all of the employment categories by early September, and many of them ran out in August. So if somebody had rescheduled, they could have potentially been out of luck.
No, that's a very, very good point. And actually, the Department of State is moving pretty quickly on this stuff. When the I-526 is approved, we are getting an email from NVC very quickly saying, hey, select which visa category you want to be in. And then we select it, you do the public inquiry, you let them, and then within just a couple of days, they issue the fee bill. I mean, they're moving very fast at NVC after the I-526E approval. For the last one that happened earlier this month for me, I actually got that email from NVC even before I got the approval notice from USCIS, right? So they obviously are communicating, USCIS and Department of State, which is great to see that happening faster. Now we need to get the file over and everything like that too. So anyway, that's some improvements in EB-5 that I'm happy to see. So Charlie, thank you so much for coming on today and speaking to us about this new data and the new fiscal year. For more information, you guys can use these QR codes and reach out to us, visalaw@wolfstorff.com. You can also reach out to me directly, jbarnett@wolfstorff.com. And thank you so much for listening, and we look forward to assisting you in the future.